Hey everyone, I'm Georgia Terry, one of your co-hosts for the Human and Wildlife Show. Welcome everyone. With me today, as always, is my co-host Dr. Christian Zase. Christian, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, hi Georgia, nice to see you. Well, we got a very interesting topic today. It's actually all about birds and how they breathe. I'm here with Dr. Mike Seear, who's a very good friend of mine. I actually was with him and David Hancock in Hokkaido in 2019, and we were looking at stellar sea eagles and having a really wonderful time. So I got to know Mike very well. Mike was actually we were head of the Children's Hospital in Vancouver for some time. And he's now retired, and he's also been working with the Hancock Wildlife Foundation for quite some time. He's always been taking a big interest in raptors. And because of his background in breathing our respiratory systems, he has taken a big interest in birds too. And it's actually quite fascinating. So today we're going to have an exciting topic. Hi, Mike. So here we are.
Hello. Thanks
Hi
for the
Mike, thanks for
invitation.
joining us.
Hi, Georgia. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and
Okay.
we should clarify in case you didn't figure it out already, the title for today's episode is Flying High, but we are not talking at all about birds flying stoned or while using cannabis. It's just about their high altitudes at which they can fly at, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so
okay.
if I am correct, okay, because birds are flying up high where there's lower oxygen levels, there's an incredible pressure for them to be efficient with how they take oxygen into their body, correct?
That's certainly true. That is certainly true.
Georgia, let's just greet everyone very quickly
Oh yeah.
on we definitely want to say, I just see Osprey Mama. That's very nice to see you again. That's great. Someone saying, Soaring Eagle saying, is Lady Hawk also there? I don't know. But thanks, Osprey Mama, for being back in Florida. That's very nice. I see Amanda. That's very nice. Gosh, Frankman is back. Wonderful. So that's great. And then on Facebook, I see lots of names there. I just want to say hello to Maureen, Anka, Jean, Xis, I can't even pronounce that, sorry. Lisbeth, Bradley, David, Melanie, Crystal, and so on and so on. The list just goes on. So anyway, the topic's exciting. We're going to jump right in, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike now. So go ahead.
Okie doke. Well, I'm not going to monopolize the
Oh,
conversation,
no,
and
go.
Georgia and you will jump in, but I'll just get going
Yeah.
with these slides. So the question today, the specific question is, how on earth do some specialist birds fly as high as a passenger jet? It's incredible. How do they do it? Um, but I would just go off on a tangent and say that there are so many questions concerning birds that they act as a convenient conduit for people to get into the wonders of biology. If you see a program on some little creature scurrying around the jungle in Brazil, that's all very fine, but we're not in Brazil. But you can look out of your window any day of the week and you can see a crow. And a crow is not just this little irritating animal out in the backyard. It's incredible. It has the ability to solve problems at about the same level as a monkey. And if you have a feeder in the back garden, you have a hummingbird. You could spend several lifetimes on nothing else other than trying to sort out how does a hummingbird fly. So they are incredible creatures. So let me just look at
Okay,
I
just
have
sorry.
so
to
we can
say,
Go
Mike,
ahead.
it sounds a little bit like you're making fun of my fellow little mammals, my rodents and mice and stuff. You're saying they're not very interesting. I mean, I
fair.
studied bats, which are objectively cooler, but still, I take a little bit of offense.
No, no, no. I'm not saying that mammals aren't interesting. What I'm saying is that birds are in front of your nose every day, and you can see that little creature out the back, and it is the most fascinating. It represents the most fascinating series of questions about biology. Of course, mammals are interesting. Lions and tigers are fascinating, and so on. But the bird is in front of your nose every day. And you can come around here in Delta and look at a bald eagle, for goodness sake. There are just so many questions to answer. So it is a gateway drug, in fact, to use your analogy earlier. It's a gateway drug into studying the fascination of biology. So let's have the next slide.
Okay, next slide. Oh, wait, sorry. Let's go here. There we go.
So just while I'm on this slight tangent about the fascination of birds, we'll be looking just at high altitude, but just look at this Bartail Godwit. This one, the picture on the right there shows this is a known animal. He's known as 4BBRW and is famous in biology circles. Godwits sit up in Alaska in the breeding season in summer, and then as the weather cools down, they head for the hills and they take flying south to ridiculous limits. He flies to, I say he because he is a he flies south to New Zealand and some years goes to Australia. Then he flies up to Korea and then he goes back to Alaska. So this bird, how many questions can you ask about this bird? For a start, sitting on the beach in Alaska, how on earth does he know where Australia is? Or New Zealand or Korea for that matter? He flies 13,000 kilometers to Australia without stopping. He's over the Pacific. And he does it in 10 days. So how does he do 1,000 kilometers a day? And he's not a gliding bird either. He's a flapping bird. So he flaps his wings day in, day out for 10 days. Nothing to eat. He's up there at 20,000 feet above the Pacific. The vastness of the Pacific heads out in all directions. He looks out and on he goes to Australia. How does he know that the winds to the south are there at that precise time, and then the winds to the northwest are fine when he goes to South Korea? I haven't got the faintest idea. How does he get to Australia? How does he survive? How does he get to 20,000 feet? Everyone says you've got to get fascinated about cosmology.
Oh, don't start that one.
Or dark matter.
We're really expanding outward quickly in this episode.
But what I'm saying is that the questions of this little bird are as profound and as unknown as cosmology.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Anyway, so if you can explain to me how Bartail Godwit can fly to Australia at 20,000 feet, I'd love to hear it. So let's
I can't. Yeah.
So I just put this slide in quickly. It's an article from a newspaper in England called the Daily Express, and they looked at some photographs brought back from an Everest expedition, and they saw this dot up along the top of Everest, and it is so unlikely to be a bird that their most logical explanation was that it's a UFO. They couldn't even conceive that it is a bird. It is a bird, by the way. It's either a bar-headed goose or it's a Eurasian crane. But that means that a lot of people look at this and the explanation for what's up there is in the realm of magic. And that is about what you are dealing with. Magic. How on earth do you explain how these birds do some of the things that they do? Right. Anyway, if we stick to the subject, just to give some context here.
Oh, you want the mouse?
Here. Get the mouse.
Go, yeah,
sure. So we have sea level, obviously. Just to give some context to people in Vancouver, the North Shore Mountains are at 4,000 feet, and the average birds that we see are in this narrow range. Light aircraft up to 10,000 feet. Certainly you get bald eagles, and you can look up some days, you just see a dot in the sky, and they're seagulls.
And do you know, are these like the heights at which they migrate at? Because I know many species, they'll fly higher when they're migrating.
Yes, of course. So the bald eagle, we're part of a tagging study for bald eagles through Hancock Foundation. And David Hancock tagged a juvenile at the local landfill. And that bird was in Alaska about 5 days later. It's just a juvenile bald eagle. And obviously they don't do it by flying. They circle up 10,000 feet, pick up a strong wind that's going in the right direction. They just put their head down, put their wings out, and off they go. A godwit has to fly, but a bald eagle is just like a vulture, puts his wings out and finds a wind and heads off to Alaska. So even a baby bald eagle can get to Alaska in 4 or 5 days. Anyway, I digress. So at 20,000 feet, you are well into the area where if you have an unacclimatized human, then about half of them will drop down dead at that altitude. The oxygen level is so low they'll be having hypoxic seizures and death. We're not talking about acclimatized people. We're talking about people who are just suddenly taken from sea level and crash, decompress to 20,000 feet. So this is a long way in the air. And yet an alpine chough, little black crow, nests at 20,000 feet. And then up here at 30,000 feet, bar-headed geese, Eurasian cranes, and others have been noted by climbers for as long as people have been climbing Everest.
And just to interject real quick, so I'm just Googling, it's 5,000 feet in a mile. So this is like 4 miles high.
Yes.
And for kilometers, there's like 3,000-ish feet in a kilometer. So that's like, oh my gosh, my on-the-spot math is failing me.
It's 9,000 meters. It's very high. It's
9,000 meters. Okay.
Yeah, 9 kilometers high. Yeah.
So Denver, for
this
instance,
is really high up takeaway. Yeah. Continue.
But Denver, for instance, is at about 5,500 feet, and they style themselves a mile-high city. But if you, even at 5,000 feet, if you go from sea level straight up to Denver, you'll be getting a bit short of breath if you start running around.
And just to remember, we know that they can fly up to 33 or even 1,000 feet because you said there was an incident where one of the birds actually flew into a plane, right?
Yes.
That's how we know that, right?
The highest recorded flying bird is 37,000 feet. So that's like putting Whistler Mountain on top of Everest. And this bird, which is called the Ruppel's griffin, a big vulture, and it flew through the engine of a jet plane flying at 37,000 feet. So there's no doubt it was up there. Whether it was up there because he wanted to be up there, or whether it was up here because he was carried up there in updrafts, who knows? So I think that's an important point to make, that individual cases are not a firm foundation for science.
Right.
But cranes, bar-headed geese clearly can fly at 30,000 feet. So this is the bit of the atmosphere we're dealing with, the troposphere. It goes up to about 11 kilometers. And it contains all the weather, the clouds, Mount Everest. The tip of Mount Everest is just up there, and the tropopause. So this is the piece of air we're talking about. Obviously, as you go higher, there's less air above you, and so the pressure drops, and the temperature drops in a fairly linear way. So you're about 20 degrees on average at sea level, and you're up around minus 60 by the time you get to the top of Everest. Why anybody would want to go up there is a mystery to me. So the first person who really studied the atmosphere was an Italian, Torricelli. There were already in the 17th century negative pressure pumps, and people had worked out that you could not raise water more than 30 feet with a negative pressure pump, and Torricelli explained why. So he didn't study water barometer, it would be a bit unwieldy at being 30 feet long, so he studied mercury, which is 10 times heavier than water, more dense than water. And if you invert a closed-ended glass tube with mercury in, then it will be supported at 760 millimeters of mercury by the weight of the atmosphere pressing down here, and with more or less a vacuum at the top. Nowadays, that is standardized into millibars, but 760 millimeters of mercury is an easier way of talking about things. So pressures raise, pressures drop. You'll hear it talked about on the weather forecast each morning, but that's what they're talking about, the atmospheric pressure, the pressure of the air above you. And already in around 1700, people were carting primitive barometers up mountains and noting that as you got higher, the column of mercury became lower. So here is the average pressure drop for an average day. So at sea level, it's about 760. It varies, obviously, but we're talking about averages. And then as you go higher, it will fall and fall and fall until the red triangle here is Everest. That's at about 240 on an average day. So, and I have to make sure this is well explained. The atmosphere contains nitrogen, principally, 78% of it, oxygen, 21%, a couple other gases, argon and CO2 and so on, about 1%, and water vapor is variable according to the day's weather. We're talking about the atmosphere here, not the air inside your chest. So the composition of the atmosphere can be divided up into pressures. So of that 760, 78% of it, or 590 millimeters, is nitrogen, or 21% at sea level, 160 millimeters mercury is oxygen. So on this graph here, sitting at sea level, atmospheric oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. Now it's important to understand that as you breathe that air into your body, other gases are added to it, principally water vapor. And so as you add water vapor, you're diluting the oxygen, so the pressure of oxygen falls. So the black line here is the pressure of oxygen in your trachea, your large airway. So it's fallen because it's already saturated with water vapor pressure. Once it gets into your lungs, you've added another gas, and that's carbon dioxide, CO2. So the oxygen partial pressure falls further. So at sea level, our what's called the partial pressure of oxygen, because it's been diluted from the air, is 100. And that means it's about 100 millimeters mercury in your arterial blood. As you go... Sorry,
the red one is, I forget, that's the oxygen in your blood or in your lungs?
In your alveoli, in your lungs.
Okay.
So the 160 in the atmosphere has been diluted by water vapor pressure, and it's been diluted by carbon dioxide. So as you go higher, here the x-axis here is altitude, as you go higher and higher, that oxygen in your alveoli gets lower and lower, and it's 0 at 8,000 meters. That is fine.
So it means you're dead at 8,000, that's what it says, right?
Yeah.
According to
that's fine. I know. So from my sort of climbing and mountaineering interest, I know, 8,000 meters, that's when you, at the very least, start climbing with oxygen, supplemental oxygen that you're breathing through. Although, and you might talk about this, some people don't need oxygen at that altitude still. But
yes.
Well, I think Mike's got to get to this. So
the summit of Everest is 9,000 meters.
Yeah, so how is that possible?
And we know that some people, an incredible effort, managed to get to the top of Everest without any added oxygen. So how do they do it?
How do they do it? Something's wrong, right?
So it's not not that this red line is wrong. That is the red line, accurate red line for the oxygen in the blood of an unacclimatized person. But it shows that this line is at least modifiable, that you can increase this point to here. So 9,000 meters is Everest, and the barest survivable oxygen is about 37, 38 millimeters.
Our interpretation of it is wrong. That's what it is,
So this line can be modified, and that's called acclimatization in climates. It can't be done rapidly. So here...
So I'm guessing that chart before was made by sort of like European or American scientists, right? We have a little bit of like I don't want to say like a Western, but probably it was made by people who live at low altitudes, right?
Yes. It can be modified, is the important point. The question is, how can it be modified? What is our ability? What do we do to allow ourselves to modify the amount of oxygen that's in our blood so that we can, not me obviously, but some people can actually get themselves up to the top of Everest at 9,000 meters, or in birds can fly at that altitude.
That's the question of birds there. Okay.
Yeah.
So the effects of low oxygen first became obvious in the 18th and 19th centuries because of the development of balloons, first hot air balloons, then hydrogen balloons. And Glacier and Coxwell became famous because they wrote a book about their experiences. Here they are posing in a studio. They've got a barometer and a thermometer, and here they are on their disastrous journey. This box here is a box of pigeons. And they found at 3 miles the pigeon would fly, but about 4 miles the pigeon dropped like a stone when they let it go. So as they got higher and higher, they were unable to open the valve that let off some hydrogen. As Coxwell lapsed into unconsciousness, Glacier clambered out of the basket, and his arms were getting very weak. He got hold of the rope between his teeth and pulled it. and they slowly, gradually got themselves back onto ground. And they both survived, and he wrote about it.
I love this artistic rendering.
Yes, I know.
This is the dramatic reenactment of, the 1800s. Like, Coxwell's like, oh.
So, recreating it afterwards, it appears that they were credited with flying to 30,000 feet in a balloon.
It's incredible, huh? That's incredible.
The French wanted to beat this. And a scientist called Tissandier and two of his friends attempted to break this record. And they did break the record, but they died in the process, except for Tissandier. And Tissandier, I think, must be the example of the most dedicated scientist, because he went on making observations while his two companions were dying and while he himself was almost dead. He went on making measurements and observations. And they landed eventually. His companions were dead, but he survived to write about it. Right. So around this time, the French again, Jourdain and Berthe, started developing machinery so they could study high-altitude physiology in detail. And this is a large steam engine here, and this is a tank that could be decompressed, and humans and animals could be studied inside it. This is Jourdain. This is the Sorbonne, by the way. The demands of Second World War meant that people wanted to know how high humans could fly in modern aeroplanes, and so the problems, the mysteries of the adaptation of humans to high-altitude flight were sorted out by these people called Rahn and Fenn, and many other people too. I mean, the history of this is fascinating. Some very interesting characters. And this graph here is what they fondly imagine is the simple solution that they discovered. But I'll make it a bit simpler.
Yeah, tell us.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
So here are two climbers from an article in an Outside magazine called Richards and Ballinger. Both had got to the peak of Everest. Yeah. This guy is using oxygen. And you can notice Mr. Ballinger here, it's incredible effort. He is the same color as his blue jacket. He's deeply cyanosed because of the level of oxygen. So he is on the peak of Everest at 9,000 meters.
Oops. Yeah.
And he's alive. So clearly this red line doesn't apply to acclimatized humans because it should be up here. So how is that? Brown and Fenn had explained it works like this. Here is the oxygen with altitude of an unacclimatized human. Remember, the atmospheric oxygen, you get knocked off a bit for water vapor. You can't change that. But the rest is knocked off because of the carbon dioxide that you excrete within your lungs. And they found that if you lowered your carbon dioxide, then you could just move this point up to here and have a barely survivable oxygen level by what is called blowing down your CO2. So, damn this thing. So
you're basically raising your concentration of oxygen by not diluting it as much with CO2.
That is exactly
correct?
right. Thank you. That's exactly right. So this is the dotted line where your CO2 is 40. This is when it's 30. This is where it's 20, and this is where it's 10. And so you're only subtracting 10 millimeters mercury from this. So this point comes up to here. So you can bend this curve with acclimatization. Now, it's not possible for humans to do this rapidly because carbon dioxide is an acid. So if we blow off a lot of carbon dioxide, we become alkalotic. And our body does not like us being alkalotic. And if you just stand there and hyperventilate, you'll become unconscious for a number of reasons. So it takes...
Yeah, can I ask, what do you mean when you say we're blowing off more carbon dioxide? Because do you mean that instead of releasing it in our lungs and mixing it with the oxygen, we're like storing more of it in the tissues of our body? Or?
No, we produce carbon dioxide as the end result of metabolism, and we express it, we breathe it out in our exhalation. And so at sea level, it just happens that the balance between usual metabolism and usual respiratory rate gives us a CO2 of about 40. If we go for a run, we're making more CO2 and we breathe faster. The body sorts it out. But if you breathe faster than you need to breathe, then your CO2 will drop because you're still making it at the same
So
metabolic.
hyperventilation, right?
So you hyperventilate.
Hyperventilate.
But we cannot do it for long. But if you hike into Nepal at slowly increasing altitude, gradually your body will make you breathe faster and your kidney will adapt and excrete bicarbonate so that your pH stays at a survivable, happy, healthy level. So that's what the main acclimatization is. You hyperventilate to blow down your CO2. And as I say, there's fascinating stories here because measurements have been made on the top of Everest and also in simulated studies where climbers have been put into a decompression chamber and they've sort of simulated climbing Everest. But it's found that acclimatized humans at the top of Everest often have a CO2 that's below 10, and that's how they can do these extraordinary athletic feats. So that's humans. That's well established. The primary response to high altitude is hyperventilation. It's been studied in Everest, studied in decompression chambers. There's a long and interesting physiology, but that in a nutshell is how they do it. Now, birds. These are the tracks of tagged bar-headed geese. They summer in Mongolia, they winter in Mongolia, and they fly down to the south of India. And these tagged geese, the tags also told them what altitude they were. So while these geese are doing an amazing effort at flying at 5,000 meters, it's not at 9,000 meters. So it's worth noting that the primary adaptation to high altitude is the same as mine. That is, don't do it. And so they are able to learn a route and they follow the valleys so that at best they'll go up to 5,000 meters. The highest that any eagle flew in this study by Hawks et al. Was about 7,000 meters. So it's a tremendous altitude in the sky to be flying, but it's not the top of Everest. So that is the primary adaptation to high altitude. Don't do it if you got any sense.
Yeah, and just to orient people geographically a little bit, all of the mountains in the world that are higher than 8,000 peaks, higher than 8,000 meters are in those dark orange. Is a dark orange area somewhere on this map? Yeah,
the purple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So India obviously was part of another piece of land over here, and it slowly moved across here with geographic drift, and it thumped into the Chinese mainland, and that crunch pushed up the Himalaya. Mm-hmm. So it went up pretty steeply. So birds flying north can fly straight up this steep climb. They blow their CO2 down and they have very low levels of oxygen, but it doesn't seem to bother them at all. But humans cannot do that.
Okay.
So, in biology, a great deal has been spent on studying the superiority of birds over mammals when it comes to exercise. And it is extraordinary how well adapted they are. It's also extraordinary to wonder how they started as a cousin of the dinosaurs and evolved a cardiovascular system that's the same as ours, a 4-chamber heart and a double circuit. So they evolved the same heart as ours, but they evolved a completely different set of lungs. So their cardiovascular system have converged, and yet their respiratory system diverged. It's quite interesting. So their lungs, for example, are completely different to a mammal. We haven't got time to go into it, but they have a larger diffusion area and the diffusion membrane is thinner. Their heart is relatively larger and they have a higher cardiac output and an ability to beat far faster than ours. Their brains are very tolerant of low oxygen and carbon dioxide, and their muscles have a higher blood supply. The muscle cells have higher concentrations of mitochondria, the energy producing. Their metabolism is different, and they have high affinity hemoglobin. You can go on at some stage but there is a but. All of those are downstream. And for any of them to work, they still need a bare survivable minimum of oxygen. And that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough attention in the biology world. So
you're saying that in addition to being more efficient, they may or may not have differences in how much oxygen they need in the first place?
Well, what I'm really saying is that concentrating on the downstream changes between birds and mammals is very interesting, but you still need oxygen. Doesn't matter how many mitochondria you have, doesn't matter how much capillary you have. They don't work if the atmospheric oxygen is zero. So there is still a fundamental basic requirement for survivable oxygen before all those other things come into play. And that is, independent of anatomy, you have to hyperventilate. There's no other way you can do it. Birds have to blow down their CO2 the same as humans, except they can do it acutely. They can just go straight up to 10,000 feet, breathe fast, it doesn't bother them, they come straight back down again. In biology, there tends to be less attention to what is called the hyperventilatory reflex in birds, and far more attention on the downstream, fascinating downstream issues. But that does rather miss the fact that the basic response to high altitude is still hyperventilation. Here is a paper from UBC, a doc called Dr. Laig, and it shows on the x-axis they have simulated altitude by just simply giving the bird less and less oxygen to breathe. And as the oxygen level falls, round about equivalent to 15,000 feet, then the bird starts to breathe. The y-axis here is the rate and depth of breathing. It doubles again, it doubles again, it doubles again. In biology, this is often said that they are increasing the flux of oxygen by breathing faster. You can't increase the flux of oxygen if there isn't any. It doesn't matter how much you breathe. The reason birds breathe faster is the same that we breathe faster. They can do it more efficiently, but they're doing it. And they're blowing down their CO2 because you cannot keep your oxygen up any other way.
Okay, just to intervene quickly. So the point, if I understand correctly, what you're making here is, in human beings, you've explained it very well, that we hyperventilate to basically expel more carbon dioxide, right? So that we can have a larger partial pressure of oxygen.
Yes, as Georgia put
Yes.
it most succinctly,
and
you are not dissolving, you are not weakening or lowering the concentration of oxygen because you've removed CO2
you've removed
from the
carbon
mixture.
dioxide. Yes.
And then so the oxygen is more concentrated. It's as
That's
simple
it.
as that.
But you're saying that in biology, or as far as birds are concerned, we're not using this argument. We're saying they're
No.
hyperventilating to push more oxygen in.
Yes.
And you're saying, well, hey, wait a minute. You come to a certain level, there is no oxygen, so that doesn't help you. That can't be correct, right?
Birds are breathing
That's-
fast on that study by Lag
Right.
to blow down their CO2.
Right.
Not.
Okay.
You can't breathe fast and increase your oxygen flux if there isn't any oxygen.
That's interesting. Okay.
So
It seems a little bit like there's two sets of adaptations, and one is sort of concerned with temporarily existing in lower oxygen environments, and the other is long-term lower oxygen environments. Because like when you acclimatize it as a person or as a bird, you're temporarily flying very high, then it seems like hyperventilating would make sense. But then there's other contexts in which, like, Tibetan people, for example, are also without even taking into account acclimatizing, they're also better suited to more efficiently take in oxygen, right? And the same goes for birds in the sense that how their lungs are set up differently allows them to better take in oxygen, more efficiently take in oxygen, whether they're hyperventilating or not. What do you think about that? You agree, disagree?
no, it's true. A great deal of human work has been done on this subject, not so much in amongst Nepalese, but more amongst silver miners in South America. And those are the highest working humans anywhere. And they have settlements at 16,000 feet. And the chronic adaptation of humans to living at that altitude includes increasing their hemoglobin so that you can carry more oxygen, and also just chronically breathing faster, and your kidneys adapt to blow off bicarbonate so that you balance the loss of CO2 by keeping your pH stable. The high hemoglobin is not good for you. You get pulmonary hypertension, and you more easily have strokes. It is not good for you to have sludgy blood forever, and it is not good for you to be, if you're planning to be a silver miner at 16,000 feet, my advice is find another line of work, because you don't make old age.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're particularly interested with the like extreme situation, like no animal lives regularly above 8,000 meters.
No.
Correct. Like
No.
the birds grow. Yeah, so you're like, when you're talking about getting to that extreme and dealing with that much of like a lack of oxygen, it has to, however you're going to compensate it for it is going to be some temporary
Yes.
mechanism like hyperventilating.
You can't live at 30,000 feet. Not a long time. But you can live at 20,000 feet, and the alpine chough does live at 20. A lot of birds actually live at 20,000 feet. And remember, that's an altitude which we cannot manage as an unacclimatized human. So if you took an average human and you just put them in a decompression chamber and you decompression to the equivalent of 20,000 feet, that would be a bad idea, because quite a lot of them would not do well. Even at 10,000, there is a huge variation. It's very strange. There's a huge variation in the ability of humans to tolerate high altitude. Some people are pretty fine with going to 10, 15,000 feet, and other people get off the plane, say at 10,000 feet, and feel just dreadful. And certainly the early stages of acute mountain sickness are going to be felt by a lot of people, even at 10,000 feet.
Yeah, but coming back now to the birds, so what you're saying is we are dealing with a temporary situation where temporary can be even a few days, right? Where birds can fly at high altitudes and they would hyperventilate. And the question now is, why are they hyperventilating, right?
Yes.
That's the key.
They're
right?
hyperventilating.
Okay. Why?
Because the primary adaptation to altitude is the same in birds as it is in humans, and that is you have to blow down your CO2,
Yep.
or you don't have any oxygen to work with. And all of those fantastic downstream things that the birds have developed over millions of years, they don't come into play until you actually have at least a bare minimum of oxygen.
And your surprise is that, at least for what you've read, the common understanding is that it is believed that birds hyperventilate for a different reason than human beings do.
Yes.
And that is, as it is stated, to increase the oxygen level. But you're saying, well, that can't be true, because they fly at altitudes where there virtually shouldn't be any more oxygen, according to this.
One of the strange, it may just be a little thing, but I've always wondered, the Rahn and Fenn, told in the Second World War, they explained all this business with a very neat equation called the alveolar gas equation.
Oh, yes.
And
Okay.
humans have alveoli, birds do not. And I think there is a built-in prejudice against applying the alveolar gas equation to birds, because they don't. The knee-jerk reaction is that birds don't have alveoli, therefore the alveolar gas equation doesn't apply. My answer is that the primary adaptation to high altitude is independent of your anatomy.
I
It's
see.
got nothing to do with whether you put an alveoli on it.
It has to do with the physics behind it.
We can get very lost in the anatomy of a bird's lung. Here's a schematic of a bird's lung
That's
here.
good.
But
Yeah.
we could be here, all day talking about the difference in the lungs of a bird and the lungs of a mammal. But you're dealing with the atmosphere, not the lungs.
That's good. Okay.
So then finally, just a list of adaptations. The primary adaptation is don't do it. And so both birds and humans do that. You use route finding, and you don't try and half kill yourself trying to fly at 30,000 feet. The next and primary physiological adaptation is to defend your oxygen level by progressive reduction in carbon dioxide. And both birds and humans do that. The birds have an innate ability to tolerate severe hypoxia and hypocarbic alkalosis, which must have been hardwired in the specialist species for a long, long time. We can't do it. We have to take a week to compensate for the loss of CO2, which of course is an acid, and so we have to balance our pH by getting rid of bicarb in the kidneys. It takes about a week to do that. as we're walking up in the pool. And there's also a shift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. I don't think we need to go into that right now. We'll be here all day. That's how they do it.
Thank you. I mean, I find it absolutely fascinating, and I don't know what do you think, Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really interesting. I think that once I got on the page of like, oh, we're really talking about these like sort of ephemeral high altitude, low oxygen situations and how do they deal with that, then I was like, oh yeah, it makes sense. Like, it seems like this is like relatively understudied compared to some other mechanisms that birds might be using. And I can see a little bit why, because birds have higher oxygen needs even when they're not at high altitudes, right? Because they're working so hard to fly, for example. Would you say that's true?
The metabolism between humans and birds is different. Their metabolic rate is higher. Their oxygen consumption, sort of compared, is higher because they're flying and we're walking. And although you get places fast by flying, you pay the price in burning up your food. So yes, their metabolic rate is much higher and can go much higher than we can.
Yeah, this was very exciting. It makes me think of, I mean, this is a bit tangential, but the movie 14 Peaks that came out recently on Netflix.
Yes,
it's about, have you heard of it?
Yes.
Yes. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't. I saw the advert.
I watched it. I've watched it twice in the past couple months. Once with my family and once with my friends. It's a really cool movie, and I mean, if anyone is interested in high altitude, low oxygen effects on people, there's a couple times in the movie where they're like running out of oxygen above 8,000 meters or something, and he kind of describes you start to get hallucinations and brain swelling and fun things like that. And so it's a very inspirational movie, though. I recommend it. It's about, for context, it's about a team of Nepalese mountaineers who are trying to climb all 14 of the peaks above 8,000 meters. They're trying to climb all of them in less than 7 months. The previous record for doing that is 7 years. So it's a very condensed timeline.
Just asking what movie it is.
Yeah.
Maybe, Georgia, can you put it into the comment, please, on YouTube and both? I don't know
Yep,
if you
yeah.
can manage that.
Just call that 14 Peaks.
14, 1-4, right? 1-4.
Yep.
14 peaks. 14 peaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. They wrote, yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's worth making the point that these Nepalese are unbelievably fit, and they've obviously also have a genetic advantage. There must be some evolutionary bits and pieces they've got together because of where they live over so long. So
yeah, they do. There is a scene where he's like hooked up with a mask at some like testing center in the UK, and they're like measuring. They're simulating low oxygen environments and athletic performance. Yeah,
it's worth pointing out that these guys can do this, but they are 1 in a million. Whereas a bird, the average Joe Blow bird, can do this. The bird, the Godwit. That bird wasn't selected because he's a top-class athlete. He was caught in a mist net. It's just a random bird flying by. And that random bird, average guy, can fly 13,000 kilometers in 10 days. So
yeah, it's a difference between like species level versus within species population level differences. Yeah.
So the average of the average bird is so far ahead of the average mammal, it's not even really a comparison.
Yeah, I mean, they're adapted. They have to do this to survive. People are just kind of doing it to push themselves for fun. It's not helping you survive as a species or anything like that to go climb these mountains. Yeah.
Fascinating, really. Wow. Well, I'm just looking if there are any questions, or if everybody's sort of a bit stunned here.
Yeah.
So if you, I'm just asking to our viewers if there's anybody who wants to ask some questions. Now's the time. So, and if you just a bit puzzled about all this and take a bit of time to digest it, I completely understand. This is not trivial. It's very fascinating, but it's not easy to understand. So
Yeah, well, the Facebook live stream has been like disconnected for me because I tried to comment on the movie in
oh,
Facebook and it said it's not there anymore. So something I think just happened maybe
really?
recently with it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mine
it's
still
very
says
strange.
live. Wait a minute,
Maybe
Georgia.
it's me, but
Yeah, mine still says
yeah.
no, or is it? Maybe it's not. It could be that something went wrong. Otherwise, I will pull down the recording and publish it again on Facebook. I because I think this is rather fascinating.
Yeah. So um yeah, I have like some I mean the birds like how their lungs are set up are is really interesting to me. And I know that you didn't want to get into it too much, but like just to give and people an idea of how weird the bird lungs are. If I understand correctly based on some of the reading that I was doing, um, they have a unidirectional flow of air through their lungs. So like we have like air coming in and out of and kind of mixing together at various parts, but they have sort of like a more of a one-way cycle happening. Um, and like basically what happens is like if you were to take a breath in as a bird, the air goes into one of your air sacs, and then you exhale, and the breath goes from your air sac, one of the air sacs, into your lungs. And then on your second inhale, the air in your lungs moves to a different air sac. I'm just pointing at random places on my body. A different air sac. And then on your fourth exhale, that same air finally exits the body. And so I guess basically the point of all that is just like there's sort of more partitioning happening within your respiratory system if you're a bird. That is one of the things that helps them be just more efficient all the time with how they're taking in oxygen. Yes.
As I say, I don't want to sort of bore everyone by going on and on about
Yeah.
bird lungs, but bird lungs, fundamental difference between bird lungs and mammalian lungs is that they separate out the two functions of a lung, which is first of all to move air through the lung, and secondly to diffuse oxygen from that air into the body. So in our lungs are like balloons. They act as bellows because they expand and contract, but they also have the diffusion right in the depths of the lungs at the alveoli. So we do the gas movement and the diffusion with one organ. Birds don't. Birds are the same as alligators. They move the air with air sacs and the movement of the body. They don't have a diaphragm because, of course, as we drop our diaphragm, we suck air in, we move our chest. Birds can move their chest, but they don't have a diaphragm. So the movement of air in and out of the bird is the mixture of their air sacs and the movement of their chest. They separate out into a separate organ, the diffusion. So the diffusion is a chunk of tissue, actually a fairly small chunk of tissue, actually. Actually, can we bring up the slide? I'll show it.
Yeah, sure. Hang on. Oops, where are
We have a comment from Frankman. Sounds like birds would make great didgeridoo players.
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. They have a single air moves forward through the lungs, so they're either perhaps actually I would say they're more like a bagpipe player because the bag and the bagpipe represents the air sacs within the bird. But I've got a diagram in here.
Yeah.
So here we have the bird. These are not to scale. It's
sorry, I have to project it first. 1 second.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, we go.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So some sort of random parrot-like bird. The airway here comes in like a trachea and divides into two, left and right. So we follow this right one. There are anterior air sacs and there are posterior air sacs. So when the bird breathes in, air moves in here. Half of that inspired air goes into the posterior air sacs. They fill up. And half of it goes up here to the dorsal bronchi and forward through what are called these paleopulmonic parabronchi. I'm sorry about the names, but those are the names we're stuck with.
Okay.
So our lungs expand and contract, but a bird's diffusion area is this chunk here. It doesn't expand and contract. It's just a chunk of tissue. The expansion is the chest of the bird and the air sacs. So as you breathe in, the air sac fills up, half the air comes up here through the parabronchi forwards, back into the ventral bronchus, and then back out up the trachea. And then through the next cycle, the posterior air sacs contract and again push air through the parabronchi. So it doesn't matter if you're inspiring or expiring, there is a forward flow of air through the periobronchi. They're always going from tail towards the head. Now, what the...
Yeah, I saw like a good quote on this. It was just what you said, but like birds are taking oxygen into their tissues both when they breathe in and when they breathe out, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a continual flow of air through these parabronchi. The parabronchi are just long, thin tubes. The capillaries are within the walls of these tubes, and the air and the capillaries meet in there. They don't have alveoli like we do. If you look at the microscopy of these parabronchi, it's a bit more complex than that, but I really don't think we need to go quite that far. But as the comment that they would make great didgeridoo players, as I say, I think I would say they more make a good bagpipe player, because you got your bag at the back here. What the biologists never seem to mention is that you breathe in and out, and yet there is constant expiratory gas from the parabronchi, and it is not conveniently explained how the expiratory gas gets out during an inspiratory cycle. It needs a bit of thinking, that one.
So you don't know
I
the
recently
answer.
saw that for a long time I recently saw that for a long time biologists thought that an animal, to have this one-way gas exchange, they would need air sacs. I should say like a vertebrate animal. But I guess recently they discovered that some lizards have this sort of similar one-way airflow, but they don't have air sacs, and they somehow do it through, the terminology used was like very clever, like tubing or something like that, which I didn't really understand. But I guess they used like colored gases and endoscopes to figure this out in lizards. So yeah, I guess there's, in short, you're right. There's a lot to be discovered and figured out, it sounds like, in birds and other animals with this.
It is tempting to think that they have valves in these systems. That is a true flap valve. So the flap valve closes and it goes this way, flap valve opens and it goes that way. In birds, and I suspect in lizards, I don't know, of course, but in birds, there are what are called aerodynamic valves. That is, they're an effective valve, because as long as the air comes in this way, it generally tends to swirl on in this direction. And then as they breathe out, it tends to then allow the sac to empty. So it functions as an aerodynamic valve, even though there isn't an actual physical flap.
That makes sense. Yeah, I did see some stuff about those like valves or flaps in birds. Yeah. Well, very cool. I think we can wrap it up unless anyone has any questions. Thank you everyone for joining, and I think Osprey Mama summed it up well. She said, "Thanks, Dr. Michael, so much for the information, a little geology, history, anatomy, and so much more." Yeah, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to my friend Mike, of course, and thanks to my co-host Georgia. So we'll see you again next week on a very different topic. We'll